So good morning and thank you for joining us for our second webinar of 2025, which is focused around retail trends, both from a commercial and a charity perspective. My name's Fiona Condren. I'm an audit partner and BDO's National Head of Charities. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by two main speakers, as well as an expert panel who join us at the end for the Q&A session. I'll shortly hand over to Laura McNaughton to summarise our agenda and to introduce the speakers, but quickly wanted to remind you that the session will be recorded and slides will be shared with you afterwards. So if you've missed anything or want to share the content with colleagues, there'll be a chance to listen back. So Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona, and morning, everyone. So welcome to our key retail themes for 2025. We host in January each year a reflection on what we've seen throughout the previous year, in particular the golden quarter. And so we're delighted to bring that to the audience today and also complement that with the spotlight lens on charity. So through the agenda today, we're going to have Tom Holt, who is one of our strategy partners here at BDO, that takes through the findings of our annual trading report. We're delighted to be joined by Robin to give the Charity Retail Association update. And then I will be back at the end of the session to host the panel Q&A, as Fiona mentioned. So there is the Q&A function. So if you can post any questions that you have throughout the session into the Q&A function, I'll look to pick all of those up at the end of the session and we'll see if we can give further insight with the panel of experts. So with that, I'm delighted to pass over to Tom to take you through the first of this morning's sessions. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Laura, and morning, everyone. Brilliant to be here and to talk through some of the themes that we saw in 24 and what we are expecting in 2025. We obviously are a number of weeks into the year, so some of these, I think, are being lived out, and we can see that in the behaviours and the actions of some of the commercial retailers that we work with and that we observe for some of these information. Next slide, please. And next one. So just some external context, and everyone will probably be very well aware of this. The news picks up on consumer sentiment quite often, but I think the long-term picture of what has happened to consumer sentiment is quite an important backdrop to retail and to consumers' spending. On the left, we've got a 10-year annualized view of consumer sentiment, and you can see that over the course of that 10 years, we were on a fairly downward trajectory. We saw a bump post-COVID, but after that, a significant decline. And in 2022, we actually started to really move up. And whilst the overall consumer sentiment is negative, we actually had 2 years of a positive improvement. So coming into 2024, we're actually feeling like we're shaping towards a positive year from a consumer sentiment perspective, although I understand that that is still a negative number. On the right, sorry, could you stay on that slide? What you see here is how that tracked over the months of 24. And you actually saw, I guess, 2 things. One, somewhat of a growing optimism coming from January through to the summer. And I'm not saying that the government and the changing government happened to impact the slide, but there was caution from the consumer in the run-up to the October budget announcement. But having said that, in the run-up to Christmas, there was a little notable increase in consumer sentiment. So I guess overall, we sit in a backdrop of very, very cautious consumer who is very mindful of their spend, very mindful of their family budget, and that does have an impact on retail. Next slide. And this is our high street sales tracker. So we run 2 sales trackers. One is for commercial high street, which is tracking all non-essential spend, so homewares, fashion, apparel, and other aspects. And we obviously have our charity high street sales tracker. So this is looking at 23 on 24. So in the blue, you can see the performance of 24, which started actually quite negative. And then again, over that summer, when we saw that consumer confidence increase, it fared okay. And then we had a couple of months, September, October, that were quite positive. The November-December mix is really the falling of Black Friday. So we had Black Friday actually fall into December, the last day of November, which was a trading day for the December kind of financial period for most retailers. So between those two, it was a lot lower on average. So the high street really overall, marginal increase month on month, but some negative months. And what we've seen into this year has actually been quite a few negative periods. On a category level, it's a very stark picture here. So if I focus on the right-hand side, I guess a category that is very familiar to the charity sector, clothing and footwear, we saw that in-store or offline, we were down 5% over the year. That's quite a considerable impact when you bear in mind that there will be inflation in those figures. And so the volume decline in that period would have been very, very notable. And we actually had a negative year-on-year impact online. Over on the left, you see food and grocery actually fare quite well. A gradual channel shift continues towards online, but that 2.2%, not far off our inflation figure for the year, therefore a fairly flat volume. Health and beauty has been the standout category for a number of years. We saw this post or during COVID, very much consumers shifting to an investment in self. That could have been in beauty products, but actually there's a big shift into health and well-being, VMS products, and all of those associated categories. In the middle here, you can see a continued channel shift and struggle of big ticket. So furniture and floor coverings, essentially big ticket items, as with homewares, fairly flat year on year. So quite a bleak picture in 2024 across a number of these different categories. Next slide. Online, as I say, was a continued strong performance for the majority of 24. So the dark bars are on the online total. And so you can see what happened post-COVID is a bit of a reset. COVID drove a significant step change in online buying behaviors, and that changed quite differently by categories. But for a lot of age groups, this has been an online phenomenon that continues to grow. Post-COVID, it stepped back a bit, but we are seeing now that this channel shift continues. And again, that anomaly there, when you see the December and November impact with Black Friday falling on a different day. Next slide. So when we look actually at the Black Friday and Christmas period, if I go back a couple of years, it had been actually quite a bleak event for retail. So we'd had a fairly flat, you can see 22 and 23, 8.7 billion sales over the Black Friday weekend. Very, very flat, marginal increases year on year. We actually saw this year, or 24, sorry, a considerable impact, and the Friday and Saturday being very, very notably up. And what that says to us is that the consumers, if I go back to that context of a fairly cautious, very budget-orientated consumer, were hunting for bargains. And two things. One, the retailers were playing in Black Friday with heavy discounts. And two, consumers were bringing forward that Christmas spend. So we actually saw a very positive Black Friday for a lot of retailers, but there would have been a cost, because when we noted the proportion of discounting that was going on across different categories, electricals being relatively high, even apparel and some clothing and homeware, I would have thought that the margins that those retailers were commanding would have been very, very down on their expectations, because they were trying to get volumes through with the heavy discounting. Next slide. And then when we look at Christmas, so this is just the month of December, again, we saw a fairly good online performance in retail, for Christmas, but again, boosted by that Black Friday. So when I look at this lens, you might argue that actually it was an okay Christmas. But if I go on one slide and look at the golden quarter in general, actually it's very flat. And that store and non-store total is very much in line with inflation over the period. So you've probably likely seen volumes of a very similar amount year on year, and actually a lot of people seeking out probably more discount orientated brands or within the retailers, they say, because I'll come on to some of the performers, the high and low performers, in a second. Next slide. When we look at the winners and losers, the grocers, very notable performance increases from M&S. That ship continues to be steered in a really positive direction, and the grocery aspect to that performing very well. Their own label and premium propositions within that basket were gaining share, and I think they fared very well. Tesco and Sainsbury's came out with positive results, but when you look at Sainsbury's 2.8%, and I go to that point on inflation, we're not seeing much volume growth here, but they actually increased their market share. So very good performance. Where there wasn't, as notably in the headlines struggling, the appointment of a new chair and Alan Leighton coming back to the retailer, and I'm sure everyone will be intrigued to see how they go. Their recent results are showing an improvement in market share actually in the first couple of months of this year. Next slide. And then we look at the broader space, apparel, beauty, health and wellness. And again, some really strong performance from people like Superdrug at 5.1%, and Card Factory 3%. You know, these are categories which are probably facing quite strong comps, and to do those numbers is really been quite impressive. Going back to this point around the budget conscious consumer, the interesting dynamic is when you look at a B&M and a Poundland, who both saw really poor Christmas periods. So B&M down -2.8 and Poundland down -7.3. And the big learning that we're seeing come out of retailers like this and from the sector in general is that the consumer understands value when they see it. And if you take Poundland as an example, the single price point doesn't necessarily yield good value when the grocers are offering compelling value in their everyday low pricing. So I think these two have got to, work a lot harder to scream value to their consumers to get them back. And I would say that the use of loyalty incentives, Tesco Club Card, Sainsbury's with their Nectar scheme, has dramatically improved the value perceptions that those retailers can gain, especially Tesco's, where a lot of those offers are on those Club Card purchases, and that proportion of shops with Club Cards attachments has grown at Tesco as a result. Next slide. So when we move into 25, what are we expecting? Well, the first picture is we are still stuck in this kind of inflationary period. We've seen that the numbers most recently have increased, and all guidance is pointing to something that may stretch up to 3%, but over the course of 25 might average out at 2.5%. And if we look at the predictions on the next slide for what that does to retail, it broadly means we're going to stay flat again year on year. So, the value that is growing is largely just the inflation impact on the sector. So not the, prettiest of pictures. If we go on a slide, I just want to paint the other impact, obviously, that everyone is aware of, and I'm sure Robin will talk to how this relates to the charity sector, is the economic headwinds that retailers are facing. And those are threefold. One, obviously, on the national insurance increase and the minimum wage. Secondly, on the business rates and the relief that has, the coming off of that relief. And there's also packaging legislation, which is impacting certain categories, especially that health and beauty kind of packaging, segment of the market. So, a flat market with headwinds, what is that driving? Well, we've already seen a number of retailers announce job losses, and we're seeing a lot of people think and consider how price is going to be impacted into next year, with some retailers coming up saying that prices will have to increase. Next slide. So before I touch on the themes that we're observing for 25, I guess a broader piece of consumer context here. Now, we actually have a consumer sentiment tracker, which we pulse with the consumer audience 3 times a year. Our next one is just coming out in the next couple of weeks. But if we take the average weekly household expenditure over the last 10 years and we split that from ONS data into product spend and then experience spend, what you'd see, and we'd seen this repeatedly in the headlines, that experience was gaining share over products. So people wanted experiences, and memories more than they wanted product. Now, obviously in COVID, we couldn't experience those things. We couldn't go out. So that decline was most notable. But if you look at where we are today in our product spend, we're 16% prior to the 2019 period pre-COVID. And on experience, we're actually less than that. Now, what this says to me is that there's an argument that people are still growing back their experience spend. So we are seeing consumers prioritize travel and some of their leisure experiences over retail, which obviously doesn't paint the best picture for the retail sector. Next slide. If you go one more, actually. And the other observation to note when we do our consumer sentiment tracker, so this chart here represents the spend intention across retail categories over the next 6 months by age. And what we've done is put the population down on the row below. Now, it is the kind of Gen Z and the younger consumers who are a little bit more positive about their spend intention in the next 6 months. That really does vary by category. Again, leisure being a bit more popular, and leisure and travel, sorry, than product spend. But when you actually look at the volumes of people, there's a considerable proportion of our population, and I'd argue into the charity sector, which is very cautious about their spend. So 55 plus are close to 10% negative in terms of their indication of their consumer spend in the next 6 months. And that represents a considerable portion of the population. So there is also a very different aspect when you look at consumer demographics and age profiles on this data. If anyone wants any more detail on that, please do get in touch, because we can cut a lot of this data 100 ways to try and find insights that might be more relevant to your individual businesses. And the trends, just to summarize, that we're expecting into 25. Obviously, it goes without saying, but people are going to focus on affordability. Now, for me, I think there's going to be investment in key line items, and that is headline prices to grab consumers' attention. But equally, I think there's going to be a real focus on people looking at their supply chain, making sure that they're improving every aspect to deliver those prices. Going round clockwise, we're seeing a continued trend in investing in wellness. That's both in products that consumers are buying, but even in apparel, we're seeing it's still the kind of alt leisure, the casual clothing aspect being still very popular. Commitment to sustainability, now this I'm sure is a topic that charities really grapple with, because on the one hand, we've got a very notable change in consumer attitudes towards reuse and recycling and buying secondhand. But actually, there's a whole heap of channels that have opened up that the consumers are able to profit from those goods, vintage and others, that may actually distract or kind of take away from the fact that people would take those products and goods to the charity sector. That's a commitment to sustainability when we ask business leaders remains, but I would say that it's probably taken a slightly not back foot, but it's probably not as prominent as some of the focus on affordability and the technology impacts that retailers are seeing. The last two, I'd note, AI, that's always a topic that we're all talking about, and we're seeing that in twofold. That's front-facing, how are people utilizing AI in the consumer journey? Now, most of that is obviously on the screen, how websites can be curated better based on the data and the evidence that the AI models can lean on to curate a better experience for that consumer. But equally in the back end, so operationally, are there manual tasks that AI can support retailers on that mean that they can reduce costs, that mean that they can hopefully keep prices down, and that they're not really passing that on to the consumer? And the last point, which really noted on the slide before, the continued importance of Gen Z. You know, they have got probably the freest wallet. They are facing less headwinds on that purse. And so tapping into that consumer is really important. And they are buying into, as I said, some of these other things, investing in wellness. They're probably the lead on sustainability focus. And I think that's an important cohort for the charity sector to be mindful of. I will pass over to Robin to hopefully tie that back into a little bit more on what's going on in the charity sector. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. That was very interesting. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Osterley. I'm Chief Executive of the Charity Retail Association. And before we just move on to the substance of what I'm going to say, maybe it'd be just worth for those people who aren't so familiar with the CRA, just talking a little bit about the sector and our place in it. So we are the trade association that looks after some 9,000 of the UK's 10,200 charity shops. We do have a few overseas members, but 90% of the UK's market, I don't want to say belongs to us, because they don't belong to us, but they are within our orbit. And that's spread across 460 or so different charities. Now, one of the very interesting things about charity retail is the diversity of it. I mean, I suppose retail generally is very diverse, but in our case, it's quite stark, because our largest member, British Heart Foundation, has around 700 shops. You will know that they are present in virtually every town in the UK. And our smallest member has no shops at all. In fact, there's quite a few of those people who join us just in order to gain insights and understanding of the sector. And we have a lot of people who've only got one shop. Micro-local activities. I love to quote my next door village up here in Hertfordshire, where there is a charity shop that belongs to a local special school. And because of the well-known nature of the special school and its importance within the local community, that charity shop is fantastically well stocked. People donate to it all the time, and it does an enormous amount of trading. It's only been open since lockdown, and already it's doubled in size. I was lucky enough to be able to move into next door as well. So that incredible sense of community is a really powerful thing for charity retail, and means to quite a large extent that the trends that you see in retail generally are not necessarily reflected in what's going on in the charity sector. I mean, sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. It's a very different world, generally speaking. And the reason that we're here is because we have a very long-standing and close relationship with BDO. They run a weekly sales tracker for us and a monthly sales tracker. And these two documents are extremely good at keeping abreast of what's going on, obviously on a weekly and a monthly basis. We also ourselves run a quarterly analysis, which is quite in depth and which has a lot of insights into how charity retail is going. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So between these three sales trackers, we do think we have a pretty strong insight into what's going on in the charity retail sector. I'm always being asked what's going to happen next. And I don't have anything like the level of predictability that BDO have and that Tom has given to you. But we've got some pretty good ideas, I think, about where the direction of travel is, at least for this year. And so this is by way of a pre-presentation summary, just some general observations on what's going on right now. So firstly, there's no question it's tough times. I've been doing this job for about 9.5 years. And this is the toughest time that we've encountered, I think, during that period. Very broadly speaking, charity retail took a huge hike particularly in terms of numbers of shops around the 2008 recession. Shops opened like there was, no other possibility of opening any other kind of shop, and that's totally settled down. And shop openings are very, very flat now. But in general, up until recently, trading has been pretty strong. And actually in 22 and 2023, there was probably the best trading period that we've ever had as a sector. And we are still strong in that area. We'll come on and talk in a bit more detail about these things in a second. So trading is still strong, that's for sure. Charity retail, as I'm sure pretty much all of you will know, relies almost entirely on donations from the public for its stock, and the donation scene also is still very, very strong. People are donating stuff left, right, and centre for all sorts of different reasons. Again, we'll talk about a little bit more about that. Tom mentioned headwinds. Quite rightly, and certainly the most significant headwind that the sector is facing right now is an increase in its costs. That's been going on for a while and will continue to do so, we're quite sure. And as a result of that, who knows where the profitability of the sector is likely to end up at the end of this year. So at the moment, our latest figures seem to show that from about a £1.4 billion turnover, our members are contributing around £1/3 billion to their parent charities, which is a huge amount. And we'll see what happens with regard to profitability in the future. So let's unpick those a little bit and have a look at trading in more detail. So this is coming from our quarterly market analysis, and this is based on the last quarter, the last calendar quarter of 2024. So if you look at it overall, like-for-like is down by about 0.3%, so almost completely flat. But as I mentioned, this is from a very, very strong base. In 22 and 23, we were looking at something in the region of, well, we were certainly looking at double-digit growth, like-for-like growth on previous years in 22 and 23. No one could ever have expected that to continue year on year. That would just be impossible, kind of exponential growth. So we're reasonably comfortable that 2024 in terms of income was fairly flat, and that's proven by the 0.3% figure. But interestingly, that figure seems to have been rather distorted by the returns that we've had from very large charities. Now, the top 4 charities in terms of numbers of shops are British Heart Foundation, aforementioned, Barnardo's, Cancer Research UK, and Oxfam. And by and large, across those 4 charities, there's been quite a significant decline, and that has pulled the overall sector figures down. And we're slightly struggling to understand why that is. But of course, one of the reasons why it might be is because they are so dominant in the market overall. A poor result in one of those charities is likely to drag down the whole sector a bit more than it would otherwise do. So if you extract the very large charities from those Q4 figures, you actually end up with a sector growth of around 3.35%, like-for-like quarter 4 24 to quarter 4 23, which isn't too bad. Online continues to be strong, and this is a very interesting phenomenon online, because of course online for charity shops is extremely different to online for commercial retail. We don't have a stock situation which allows us to put stock online. So online trading for charity shops consists largely of trading on places like eBay and Vinted for treasure. So if someone brings in a wonderful, I don't know, beautiful Swiss watch into a charity shop, they might well put that on eBay in order to try and get a national, indeed international audience for it, rather than try and sell it in the shop. But if I want to buy a red jumper, it's no good me looking online in a charity shop at the moment to try and find a red jumper, because that stock won't be online, because it moves extremely fast. It's very difficult for a charity retailer to understand or know what stock they've got at any one moment. So because it's all donated, so they may well have websites, and a lot of them do, that sell new goods. And in a variety of ways, but this sort of emphasis on online that is so clear in the commercial sector is not quite the same thing in charity shops. Nevertheless, 12.6% like-for-like growth Q4 24 is pretty impressive. Interestingly, average transaction values, which are really quite small compared to most commercial retailer activities. I mean, we're looking at somewhere between £6 and £7, or maybe just over £7, declined slightly in Q4, but average transaction numbers were up a bit, and so that whole thing has ended up a little bit flat. Charity retailers have suffered from a lack of income from what we erroneously really call RAG. So this is the sale of excess stock out the back door to textile collectors for onward sales in various different parts of the world, or for actual recycling. There's been some huge problems in that particular market, which we haven't got time to go into now. But as a result, rag income has declined from what used to be around 2% of the charity retail sector's income to probably about 1%. And we think that that will continue to decline. In fact, a lot of our members are not budgeting for any income from rag for the next financial year. And in terms of that Christmas picture, a bit like Tom said, really, the picture is mixed. Larger charities actually did quite well at Christmas, 8.8 like-for-like growth, and smaller ones declined. So this is where we get troubled by the diversity of charity retail. Things are very different in one part of the sector to other parts of the sector. So let's just have a little bit more in-depth look at donations. These are still strong, as I mentioned. In terms of volume. That was the big reveal. In terms of volume, they are still strong. In terms of quality, they have gone down substantially. And this has been a trend that has been going on for the last 2 or 3 years, actually. So in Q4, 67% of our respondees reported that the quantity of donations has had a positive effect, but half of them reported that the quality of donations has had actually a negative effect on their income. Now, most of this, there's no question, is about fast fashion. If you buy, I say this all the time, you buy a nice sparkly top from, any one of the fast fashion retailers that you can think of, but let's just say Shein, because they seem to be sort of, current in everybody's thinking. You buy a sparkly top there for £5, you wear it to a party. Now, I know, being a fantastic party animal, that you're never allowed to wear the same thing twice at a party. So that's it, you're done. That £5 top, you're never going to wear it again. It ends up with a charity shop. And what are we supposed to do with a £5 sparkly top? You sell it for 25 pence, maybe 50p if you're lucky. And it's barely worth the shelf space that it takes up. So that is what I mean by a decline in quality. And I think there's also, so that's a major, that for me for us is the major factor. The slightly less significant factor, and Tom alluded to this, is the fact that a lot of people used to have a bag in their bedroom, didn't they? So, rummaging through your wardrobe, you find something you don't want, pop it in the bag, goes to a charity shop. Now, quite often, I think people have got 2 bags in their bedrooms. One, is this of high enough quality to sell on Vinted or similar platforms? And 2, if it isn't, it goes into a charity shop. So I think that has probably had a bit of an effect on donations quality as well. So I mentioned costs, and I don't think that any of us have seen the kind of cost pressures on charity retail that are coming through. I don't think any of us have seen those before. We think that the national insurance contributions alone, I mean, look, national living wage is a good thing, okay? But national insurance contributions are likely to cost the whole charity sector around £1.5 billion. And just the shops belonging to those charities, not any of their sort of support network or the wider charity scene at all, just the shops are likely to suffer to the tune of about £200 million. This is big ticket stuff. And of course, inevitably, the way it's been done, the NIC increase, is going to affect smaller organisations even more than larger ones, because smaller organisations are going to be brought in because of the increase in the thresholds. So this is really painful, and we have written to the Chancellor, and we mentioned it to the Environment Minister yesterday. And, it could have quite a significant effect on the number of shops, and it's certainly going to have an effect on the profitability of the shops during the course of next year. As I mentioned, the national living wage is a good thing. Let's face it, a lot of our charity members are in business to prevent poverty, not to increase it. So almost all of our members subscribe to the national living wage rather than the national minimum wage. And although this is a good thing, it is clearly creating considerable pain. The excess stock issues that I mentioned, if we can't get our stuff collected out the back door from rag merchants for whatever reason, or it's not worth worth their while coming and collecting, then probably that stuff is going to have to go into waste if we can't find alternative ways of selling it, which we are trying very hard to do. And if that happens, that will increase costs, because obviously the cost of disposing of that volume of stuff is going to be considerable. And on top of that, there are clearly normal inflationary pressures which are hurting as well. So what responses have we seen from the charity sector to these potential increasing costs? So we did a survey not long ago saying, you know, when these costs are, well, shortly after the budget actually, when these costs are being brought in, what do you think might happen? You can read as well as I do, but these are the responses that our members identified. So, you know, a third of them are going to have to reduce staff, they think. Certainly, they may have to reduce opening hours. They may have to reduce the amount of hours that you know, exist in a shift for staff. A quarter of them are likely to have to close shops. Many of them are scaling back new shops. And guess what? 2/3 are going to have to put up prices. It's interesting, the Chancellor said, you know, businesses will have to put up prices to cope with these kinds of things, thus kind of sort of admitting that it was a personal tax, even though it didn't look like a personal tax. Unfortunately, charities can't really do that, because most of the time they're not selling stuff that they can put the prices up. Obviously, the one place where they do sell stuff is in their shops. So shops are going to have to take the pain. And of course, what that's going to do is that's going to affect those people who use charity shops for economic reasons. You know, a further, almost like a hidden tax resulting from that. So all of that is going to have an effect on profitability. I do think there might have been a certain amount of over budgeting in this year. Well, at least not this year now, because I think everyone knows exactly the score, but 24, 25, there may have been some over budgeting based on an excessive degree of optimism. Who knows? That isn't going to happen again. But I want to say this is a brilliantly creative and innovative sector where people really do understand how to leverage their assets in the best possible way. And there is an extraordinary amount of creativity. This is particularly being noticed in attempts to replace income from RAG, which has disappeared. All sorts of different things, but people are doing like kilo sales and having lock-ins and, you know, all sorts of exciting things. It is too early to say, but we are pretty sure that most members are going to have are predicting a drop in profitability, certainly after the budget kicks in other words, for the next financial year. There's no question that prices will go up, and this is quite tough times. So, in summary, quite a few of our members are predicting probably the hardest year that this year is going to be the hardest year that any of them can remember. But when I say hard, I am not saying this is terrible. I'm not saying there's a disaster, and I'm certainly not saying there's an existential threat or even an existential threat to our members as a result of this. They will cope because they are very good at coping, and because they are very motivated to coping, because that £3 billion that they provide to their parent charities is absolutely vital income. And to end on a positive note, which I think is always a good thing to do, please note that 68% of our members are still opening or considering opening new shops, and only 36% of them are closing or considering closing new shops. And that overall for the sector has got to be a good thing. So in the words of the famous Gloria, we will survive, but it certainly is tough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robin. So before we get to the panel Q&A, I wanted to give you a flavour of some of the themes that we've been seeing in the BDO Charity Retail Sales Tracker, so the CRST. We're actually celebrating our 10th anniversary this April. And over the past decade, we've gathered lots of insights and have closely monitored the trends on a like-for-like basis. For charities with larger retail estates, we collect data on a weekly basis, and for others, there is a monthly data collection. Contributors to the weekly report receive a summary of their data against their peers. And we also share like-for-like sales for charity retailers in comparison with their commercial counterparts, and provide details of commercial retail footfall stats, which provides another useful insight. As you can see, we also have a high-level summary commentary to support the data and reflect on whether there are known factors which have impacted football, such as seasonality, weather, any unusual or one-off events. Way back at the beginning, we started with a small number of charity retailers, but in the weekly tracker, we now have 14 of the largest charity retailers contributing over 3,500 of the total shops population, which is, you know, a great population to be monitoring. And their data is shared alongside their peer groups, both on a weekly and a monthly basis. So in 2019, we had the 6 retailers with more than 250 stores, and that equated to 3,134 units, or an average of 522 per retailer. And in total, these stores represented sales per shop of just over £2,300. By 2025, our weekly tracker still had those large 6 retailers. There was a slight drop in the number of units that they had, on average only 490, but they were reporting a higher income per store. So there was around about a 6% decrease in store numbers, but a 30% increase in the average sales per store. We know that some of the larger charities have experimented with different size and format of stores, but what's really interesting to me is that this seems to be corroborating the view that to improve overall financial performance, it's better to focus on having stores in the right place, the right size, rather than the absolute number. And I expect this is a trend that we'll continue to see. And on the next slide, I'm just summarising here what we do by way of the monthly tracker, as well as the information that goes back to all the participants. We've also more recently developed an FD summary report, which provides a higher level overview, and copies of these reports are available to download historically from our website. If you're a charity retailer that doesn't already take part and you've got more than 10 stores, you're still very welcome to join the tracker at any time. And if you'd like more information, please let me know. So on this slide, we're looking at the trends in 2024, and the trends highlighted in the QMA report, which Robin has discussed, reflect very much of what we're seeing in our weekly CRST. A big point of difference, of course, is the sample that's used. So the weekly CRST is mainly those large retailers, and the sample is small compared to a larger spectrum in the monthly report and CRA's quarterly reports. So what are we seeing in this data? Well, the graph shows us that on a like-for-like basis, total sales have been positive for only 18 out of the past 52 weeks on a like-for-like basis, and 4 out of the past 10 weeks. However, donated sales have only been positive for 10 out of those last 52 weeks and 2 out of the last 10 weeks, whereas new goods sales have been positive for the vast majority of the time, more than 46 weeks out of 52 and 7 out of the past 10 weeks. After 2 positive total like-for-like sales months in October and November, sales did fall back in December, and key factors pointed to lower footfall, which impacted the high street generally, as well as unsettled weather patterns, which impacted certain regions in the run-up to Christmas. On the next slide, we specifically focus on new goods sales as a proportion of total sales. And this is showing that since Q3 of 2022, new goods as a proportion of the total has been growing steadily. And in December 24, it reached its highest point, averaging 24% of total sales. So whilst new goods sales as a proportion has been rising, it is trending down in terms of like-for-like, while donated goods sales are very slightly trending up over the past 12 months. And if the trend towards more new goods continues, then stores may need to deploy more by way of security measures, etc. And something that Tracy Kenworthy will probably pick up as part of the Q&A is how charities can look to prevent a growing prevalence of fraud of new goods in stores. So you can see very clearly on this slide that while new goods sales have been increasing, donated goods, as Robin and others already commented on, remain the mainstay of charity retailers in terms of absolute volume and value. What our data doesn't yet capture, sorry, just down the previous slide, what our data doesn't yet capture is the balance of new and donated goods sales generated online. The evidence would suggest that the trend of growth in online sales will continue, and we may therefore look to increase the scope of our reporting for those charities who can provide that data for both new and donated goods sold online, notwithstanding the comment Robin made about how charity retailers look to put donated goods online only when they're of a much higher value. And finally, this table's got a lot of detail in it, but the main point I just wanted to pick up here before we move to Q&A is the gift aid conversion rates are relatively stable, with actually a slight uptick in the first quarter of 2025 based on recent data that I've seen. And we've got a number of services which look at gift aid processes, compliance and optimization. And I know Heather would be happy to answer any questions on this shortly. We also recognise that better use of in-store technology and training for staff using EPOS systems may also help to enhance gift aid recovery. So a few things to think about there. So finally, just before I hand back to Laura for the Q&A session, and just a reminder, do put your Q&A in the function in Zoom. I just wanted to let you know that we are hosting another exclusive event for charity CEOs to explore retail trends with a very select number of commercial counterparts, and that event is taking place in May. This is the second of these events, with the first one being run last autumn in conjunction with the CRA and Robin. As I say, it is an exclusive event, and we've already lined up some really exciting guests from the commercial world. So if you would like your charity to be represented at this event, please do let me know. So without further ado, I will hand back to Laura for the Q&A.
Thank you, Fiona. And thank you for all of our speakers for what was an interesting insight into what clearly is a challenging landscape for everyone, but some real positives is highlighted by Robin. So I'm joined by a number of people actually, and as Fiona said, do pop your Q&A into the chat. I'm going to start with one that's been posed from Gemma. Robin, to you first. The reconciliation that charity retailers are going to have to do between the need to increase prices for the viability of the stores versus the decrease in the quality of donations. Is there anything that you have seen from the members or you personally have seen that can give a bit of insight to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there's two answers to it, really. The first is at a local level, it is possible to do local donation campaigns and to try and ensure that the quality of donations that you're getting is as high as it possibly can be. And we've reinforced those messages quite a lot, actually, on the media recently, where this particular issue over quality of donations and quantity of donations as well, connected to the kind of RAG thing, has seemed to have raised a lot of interest in the media. And we've been speaking quite a lot about trying to implore the public, if you like, whose generosity is fundamental to charity retail, to try and implore them not to treat charity shops as household waste sites. So you can do a local donations campaign. You can try and increase the amount of quality donations that you get. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is sell what you've got, you know, and that's where things like kilo sales, a number of our members are converting some of their shops to value propositions. So, you know, taking head on places like Poundland and Primark and those kinds of things, and really trying to sell stuff off extremely inexpensively so that people can take advantage of that. And as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, a lot of ways of trying to sell what you've got. So I don't expect that sparkly top I was talking about suddenly to go up from, you know, 25p to £2 because of the issue. That's not going to work. So they're going to have to sell those kinds of things in volume, and then at the same time try and ensure that they're acquiring higher quality stock where possible. I mean, I'm not saying that charity shops, people get the impression that charity shops have no quality stock. That certainly isn't true. It's just a reduction in it that has caused a bit of pain. There's still plenty of really good value stuff that you can get in charity shops, and there is plenty of new goods as well for people to, you know, at fantastic prices for people to search through.
And Tom, I suppose looking at it from the other side, clearly a lot of the data points from a charity perspective has been new product growing significantly. So any thoughts from, I guess, hot areas and trends where people might want to think in that blend between the donations and the new products and what they could be thinking about?
I mean, I echo what Robin said. It is a very difficult challenge that retailers or charity retailers are going to face. And I would point to the second point and the observation around how you, both from a visual merchandise perspective, curate some of these lower item values and or promote some of those higher item values. I mean, I'm always intrigued, and it is, as Robin says, a local kind of issue. But the more that I think the charity sector can embrace some of the trends that the younger generation are seeing, both in the apparel that those consumers are wearing and in how it's curated, the better. And that doesn't mean that your visual merchandise in the front of your store becomes just focused on an 18-year-old, but it is actually just taking into consideration how the garments are put together and also how you're trading your stock. I would say that the more that can be done to bundle and to kind of promote attachment for some of these items that are just on their individual basis not going to be commercially viable at 20-30p or whatever it is, the better, because you kind of want that consumer to convert and take something rather than nothing, and getting clearance of some of their stock with some of the higher value would be the best interest for the charity retailers.
Thanks, Tom. And just picking up that point in Fiona's last slide around gift aid, and Heather, where income is something, and we'll go to Mark, your question in a second, but where income generated by the charities is clearly prevalent, what can they do to improve retail gift aid take up, and what issues are we seeing? Just as any hints and tips you can give the audience today.
Okay, I would say empowerment, actually. Empowerment to those that are in the shops, those that are working there, the volunteers, making sure that they're trained, they know exactly what the gift aid system is, how it works, and how it benefits the charity, and just so that they're comfortable talking about it to donors that come through. So having that conversation, not feeling uncomfortable, bring it up, saying how, what the benefits are, and also empowering the donors so that it's easy for them. So it's not just a conversation. Are there things when they drop off goods? Is there something visible that they can see, that they can read, that says, look, this is the amazing work we're doing. This is how much we have received in gift aid over the last year. This is how much we think we potentially could. There may be some estimates of, lost gift aid that could have been claimed. Just so that people realise that it's not an extra cost to them when they're dropping things off, that there is that extra donation there available that the charities can benefit from. I think even the practicalities of empowering people, where do people drop off their donations? Have they got time to do the gift aid declarations? That kind of thing. Is it physically, can they do it, or is it, oh no, actually I've only got 2 seconds to fling this to you and disappear? So just thinking about empowering those in the shop, empowering the donors. Things that we've seen, I think Ford was mentioned earlier, that's one of the things that has come up recently, and I think HMRC are keen for charities to do a holistic all over check of what's happening, what happens in the charity, what happens with people in each stage of the process of gift aid. So having those checks and balances in place are really important right now, just to combat any fraud, see if there's any weak links, just do a kind of gift aid health check, see where things are at.
Thanks, Heather. And Mark in the audience has asked another question that clearly charity retail is significantly about generating income for the charitable. Is there a time to consider return on investment from retail versus the return on investment from other forms of net income? I know, Robin, when we were last together, you sort of had some views as to kind of the reach of the charity retail. And any thoughts on that, perhaps, before we move to Katie to maybe look at where some of those ROIs do need to have a slightly closer lens?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Mark. We have been talking about this kind of stuff for a little while. Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly that would be actually benchmarking the profitability of retail against other forms of income would be an incredibly useful thing to do. The trouble is, as you say yourself in the question, that it isn't just about financial profitability. Charity retail performs a number of other functions as a kind of almost unintended consequence of what it's doing. It provides an incredible amount of visibility in the high street for charities. It provides charities with the ability to have a portal to their services so people can walk in and access their services. We produced at the end of 23 a social value report, which identified £75 billion worth of social value created by charity retail for staff, customers, donors, and volunteers, and that was using Treasury methodology. So it wasn't just something that we'd invented. So those things, which are much harder to quantify than the profitability, would need to be taken into account, I think, if you're doing a direct comparison in those ways. I'm not saying it's not a good thing to do. I'm saying it's very hard, and it would be very hard to get it right, I think. And as we know, a number of chief execs take a very different views about this. There's a spectrum from people who think that charity retail is an absolute 100% necessity to people who are quite skeptical about the amount of profitability that charity retail provides. Most people sit somewhere on that spectrum, it's sort of in the middle, and some people sit at either end. So I think it's a very complex issue, but a genuine sort of slightly hard-nosed edge at looking at the profitability of charity retail will be undoubtedly beneficial for charities. Yeah.
And Katie, clearly, whilst we want to look at this from a positive lens, there are some challenges that the people on the call today are going to have to face around their retail proposition, and looking at closures that we've seen people move towards because of, as Mark's point, it just doesn't work. Thoughts and advice on that area?
Yeah, so I think, I think we are sort of aware, it's coming up in the previous talks that some charities are considering sort of closing some of their stores. And I think really the key things that sort of management teams and sort of boards need to be sort of considering is really sort of, properly understanding the performance of your portfolio and the sort of KPIs that you're going to be sort of assessing those stores that might be part of a closure plan. But it's also the very practical aspects of, understanding your property leases, how long is it until your next break clause, the implications of any termination clauses. In essence, it's kind of understanding what potential contingent liabilities may be triggered. So things that aren't necessarily sort of on your balance sheet at the moment, but things that may be triggered if you do go into a closure sort of process, and understanding the potential costs of those, and then also what might be achievable from some sort of commercial conversations sort of with landlords. So we need performance, we need property, and people is so the next sort of big consideration, I would say. So it's really important to have, so your people strategy in place for your employees and your volunteers as well, and conducting a compliant redundancy process if that's required, and understanding the potential costs of those, so that can all be fed into a really sound financial plan that can be presented internally to the relevant committees and boards, so that we're ensuring good decision making and governance as well. And I just say, in all change circumstances, it's really important to have a really good comprehensive communication strategy internally and externally, which will obviously link into sort of reputational management. And just as a business restructuring person, just to say that if you are coming at these decisions from a financially challenging situation, then there are tools available to help manage some of these situations to find a more positive outcome. But each situation is unique, so you do need to seek professional advice.
Just from an IT transformation perspective, EPOS systems are clearly really important to have, good technology that will capture data and give people good MI. What sort of bits of advice can you give the charity retail sector?
I think ultimately next generation point of sale systems can improve the overall customer experience. So I think kind of dovetailing with gift aid and interaction with customers, that ability to have a more up-to-date profile where a customer can go and drop off goods, complete the application online, so to speak, through the EPOS system, I think can be quite powerful. So I think ultimately by investing in better technology, you can end up with a more fluid process and better data at the end of the day. So I think next generation EPOS systems are quite affordable, and opportunities around taking advantage of digital transformation in that regard can help the back end processes from a charity perspective.
Great, thank you. And dare I squeeze in one more for Dale on this national minimum wage issue? Do you have any advice on perhaps how to consider possible mitigations?
Yeah, just on the minimum wage, and we mentioned earlier, Robin's presentation was talking about a lot of the employees within the sector paying at the national living wage rather than the national minimum wage. That can create a buffer in those pay rates, in the published rates, to what the legal rate is to what is actually being paid in that sector. So a lot of organisations are looking at things like pension salary sacrifice as a way to reduce those NI costs, while still maintaining that NMW compliance, but also supporting some of the additional costs that business may face from April this year.
Thank you. Laura, I think we probably just need to pull everything to a conclusion at this point now. I'm sorry, Tracy, that we didn't get a chance to talk about your brilliant fraud report, but we can share that with people afterwards. So yeah, I know people have got busy days ahead. So I'm going to draw this to a close. Thank you to everybody who's given up their time and expertise, and very special thank you to Robin and Tom for your presentations. If you've submitted a question and we haven't had a chance to answer it, we will get back to you directly. And the session has been recorded and will be shared with you, possibly with the exception of the bit in the middle with the fire alarm. We will be hosting another webinar in May, when we hope to have had the SORP exposure draft and had an opportunity to go through that in some detail. So we'll give you some practical ideas and steps of how to deal with the proposed changes in the SORP. So there's plenty coming down the line, plenty to look out for. So that just leaves me to say thank you again for joining us this morning. Apologies for slightly overrunning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.